Welcome back to the teaching of the book of Daniel. We are looking at chapter 5 right now, and we'll be digging into what is called the writing on the wall. I guess that's basically where we got the saying from, the writings on the wall. We're going to look at what the king has been through at this time. Remember, in chapter 4 we've discovered that he is glorifying God in heaven. He had his opportunity to repent, and we believe that that was his salvation. You know, the first Gentile king who managed to get saved, who managed to find an opportunity to repent and to worship God and to proclaim his wonderful name and his wonderful work. So we continue to look at chapter 5 and what happens here. So this, now we're looking at around 539 BC. We're looking at 67 years later since Daniel was taken into captivity, and he's been working under the king's command and he's been under the king's care all his life. And so now we look at a different king coming into position, which we believe is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He is Belshazzar, King Belshazzar. And at this time, what was happening, if you look at the history of Babylon and world history at the time, the king that was supposed to be in position was basically nowhere to be found. Nebuchadnezzar has died already, and so we find now that his son Belshazzar has taken over and is ruling and reigning. So it's possible at this time that Belshazzar does not know anything about Daniel or what has happened to King Nebuchadnezzar, or he's just ignorant to the fact that Daniel has this gift and Daniel has been working in King Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom or rule or reign at the time. So at this time, we will recognize, now we've come to learn that the Medes and the Persians have come together. They've joined forces and they are attacking places all over the world. They've gone all over the world to attack, and now they've reached Babylon, and they were literally at the walls or at the gates of Babylon, trying to penetrate or infiltrate to see if they can take over and conquer Babylon. But because Babylon is such a big kingdom, and you know, the kings over the years have managed to upgrade their security, their soldiers, and their walls were so big. It was said that 4 chariots could fit on the width of the wall, and the length was just a very high hall, so nobody could really penetrate Babylon at that time. It also ran next to the Euphrates River, which was obviously a challenge for people who want to cross that river and to get into the city of Babylon. It made it very difficult for them to access Babylon if their intentions were on war. But war was going on. There was a war happening at the time. The Medo-Persian is what we call them. They began to attack. And during this time, whether King Belshazzar was aware that they were approaching and just ignorant to the fact that they could conquer them, he decided to have a banquet. And this banquet was for 1,000 of his nobles, and they drank wine, drinking wine and giving orders then at the time to bring the silver goblets, or the silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar has taken from the temple. So this speaks of all the elements that was the silver cups and dishes that was in the tabernacle when they conquered Israel. King Belshazzar asks for this now. He is so arrogant and completely out of his mind at the time. He decides to call for this, and so that they can serve out of these elements and drink out of these elements. And so he allowed the kings, their noble wives, his concubines, and everybody to drink out of this. If you continue to read, we are in chapter 5 now. We are approaching verse 5. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared, and it wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. So while they were dining and while they were having fun and feasting, and his idea to bring in all these goblets and all the elements that was taken from the temple, it just sparked God's reaction. It got God's attention, and God just began to write on this wall. He begins writing on the wall, and this, if you continue to read, the king watched at this hand. Watch as this hand was writing, and his face turned pale, the Bible says. He was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave in. He's never seen anything like this before, probably never heard of something like this happening. And here you find God beginning to write on the wall to get his attention, to get him to realize that you've crossed some boundaries now, using the elements that was set apart for the work of the priests in the tabernacle or in the temple. And so the king called out all the enchanters, just like his father did. Remember back in chapter 2, or his grandfather. And he called these people and said that these men from Babylon need to now just read this writing and tell him what does it mean. Because he is scared. As we've read the description there, he's probably fainted. And so he's sitting down. People are probably helping him to catch his breath. And now he's calling, let's get people to come and translate again or interpret what is happening now. So all these wise men came once again, and nobody could tell what this writing was, obviously. And we find that it says about the queen mother that stands up. She hears all this thing happen, all those noises and the racket happening in the palace. And she comes and she wants to find out what's happening now. And then she comes and she speaks and she says to him, don't be alarmed and don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. Okay, so clearly his grandmother is aware of Daniel's gifts and of Daniel's talents. And because Daniel is a man of God and a man of honor, she recognizes that this is a job that only he can do. So she explains to the king that there is a certain man, a Hebrew man now, that will be able to translate this for you. He has wisdom like that of the gods, she explains to him. So she explained to him that your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him as chief of the magicians. But clearly, if he wasn't there at the time, it obviously just shows that Belshazzar did not care for him. Belshazzar obviously never intended on using his services, or he wasn't even the first one to come to mind at the time. So anyway, they call for Daniel, and she says, call him and he will tell you what it means. So Daniel was brought before the king. Continue to read in verse 13. And the king said to him, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? So just wanted to make sure. He says that I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you and that you have insight, intelligence, and an outstanding wisdom. So clearly he doesn't know Daniel. However, he does recognize the fact that Daniel is an exile, which means he is a servant. But even though he's a servant, he also then recognizes that he has insight, intelligence, and an outstanding wisdom. Okay. So he says that the wise men that I brought before me could not explain this writing to me. And I heard that you are able to interpret these things. So when you look at this, you can just picture, Daniel hasn't been of service. He's probably been doing what he had to do in the offices of the king, but he hasn't really been interpreting any dreams or visions. But clearly, he's a Hebrew. He's a wise man. So he's been kept busy with things. And with the news all around them that the Medo-Persian kingdom is now upon them, ready to attack. Daniel, I believe God has showed him already what is about to happen, what is about to transpire. And when he got summoned, he already knew that he probably needs to step in somehow, some way, to bring some clarity to what is happening. Look, these men were standing at the gates and at the walls already, just trying to find a way, probably, or strategy just to come into Babylon and take over and take control. And so Daniel answered the king, and he said to him, because obviously the king did what all kings does, if you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made third highest ruler in kingdom. third highest ruler already says that there was a king in place. And then, like I've explained earlier, and so there was a king in place, and then it was Belshazzar's father, who's just gone missing. And so Daniel will then be third ruler in the kingdom. Okay, so that just makes sense to see that Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Okay, Daniel was like, he already know what's going to happen. I believe if you read his answer, and you can just sense he's like, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and tell you what does this mean. So clearly he figured that we were going to be overthrown here, dangers lurking at the gates, and anything can happen. Was he certain that God will save them? He's been in exile now in Babylon all his life, since he was 14 years old. And so, he probably knows, okay, the time has probably come now where Babylon is going to be overthrown. And he already has insight when it comes to what's going to happen, kingdom after kingdom after kingdom, based on the vision that he interpreted to King Nebuchadnezzar in previous chapters. So he comes and he says to him, he says, O King, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the people and nation and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. And those he wanted to promote, he promoted. Those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was disposed from the royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdom. So he comes and before he translates or interprets to King Belshazzar what the writing is on the wall, he decides, let me give you some history on who this God is. Let me give you some history of what has happened in the past, because it doesn't look like you are clued up with the history of the kingdom, with Babylon and with Nebuchadnezzar. So he comes and he says to him, you, Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself. He's already seen the way Belshazzar has operated, I suppose, over the years since Belshazzar has came into power. And now he's realized that this is my time to just speak, And I think, like I said earlier, he probably doesn't think that they were going to survive this invasion from Medo-Persia. And so he's just, let me just lay it all out there. And so he speaks up and he says to him, you yourself have come up against God. So you must understand now, when he walked into the room, right, he says to him, you have the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles' wives and concubines drank wine from them. Clearly he was disgusted with this king. And he said, you praise the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, and wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand you. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and your ways. He tells him exactly what he feels and exactly what position he's in right now, and exactly why that hand, he saw that hand writing on the wall. It's because of what he did. He's dishonoring God by taking because he walked into this place, into this banquet hall. Everybody's drinking and having fun and, sitting and being merry. And here the king is shocked out of his mind, trying to figure out what this means. What's this writing on the wall? And clearly Daniel came in and looked around and he saw all these, because he recognized that this was the goblets that was from the temple, and these things are holy, these things are sacred, these things are set apart, and God has just set it apart for certain use in his temple. And so here he looks at him and he's just, you've really gone too far. You've really gone too far. But he sent you this inscription, and he tells him this is what is written there. What was written on the wall was, verse 25, MENE, TEKEL, UPHARSIN. Okay, this is what the words mean. He goes on to say, he says, MENE, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. And he says TEKEL means you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. He says Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persian. Then Belshazzar commanded that Daniel was clothed in purple and gold and was placed on his neck. It was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, that same night, King Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So when Daniel interpreted this, it was, very specific. He didn't waste time to still explain. He didn't waste time to go into how we get to this. Like I said, he was probably just a little bit angered and disgusted at the king's actions, and the king still had the audacity to summon him and ask for his service at such a late time. However, he figured, let me speak this, because Daniel already knew what was about to happen. The Medo-Persians was going to invade, and they were going to be successful, just like in verse 30, which simply speaks of when we go back to that statue. Remember that statue that King Nebuchadnezzar saw in his vision, and Daniel had to interpret that vision. And so that statue started with the golden head, and the golden head was, like Daniel said, God has shown him the interpretation. The golden head was Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylon kingdom. And here we see the second half of the statue coming into play. We see that when they took over, when Darius the Mede took over the kingdom, that's where we're going into the silver half. So it's going to be the silver half, which is the upper part and the arms of the statue. If you remember, the statue was standing like that. And so that will be the Persians and the Medes coming together to join forces and to take over Babylon. So now we're heading into the second part of Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the statue. And just like that, he takes over Babylon, and they become the biggest empire or kingdom, because if you can imagine the amount of wealth that Babylon possessed, and the amount of wealth and the amount of land that they have, and now it's been conquered just like that. And I think if I just look back at why Daniel was clothed in purple and Belshazzar made sure that happens before they invade, I think he probably hoped that if he pleased, because clearly I just get the picture that Daniel wasn't pleased about what was happening. So for him to quickly then just clothe him with purple, give him his gold chain, and place the chain that he placed around his neck, and he proclaimed now that he's the third highest ruler, he was probably hoping that Daniel could somehow just stop everything from happening. Just stop from him being weighed out on scales, and he was found guilty. He was found, the kingdom is now going to be divided, and it's going to be given to the Medes and the Persians. So he was probably hoping in him acting out like that, Daniel could make a difference. But all this clearly was out of Daniel's hands. This was all in God's hands, and this was prophetic, and it needed to happen no matter what happens, or who does what, or who says what, or who intervenes. I just want to quickly maybe just give you some insight on the inscription that was on the wall. If you look at the inscription on the wall, and God actually using his hand to write on the wall, which means he was very serious about what Belshazzar was doing, and how he was acting out with these elements that was set apart for priests only in his temple. He actually came and he wrote with his own hand, which just speaks about him writing on the tablets of Moses. When I think about that vision of the hand that the king saw, I could just think back when he wrote on the tablets, when he wrote the 10 Commandments to Moses. And when he wrote those words, if you look, and we've tried to translate it, many students have tried to really translate it, and how Daniel got to this so quickly just by looking at the inscription. He already knew what it meant. MENE means mina, which means a minor in Aramaic, which means number. Okay, stands for the word number. It just means that the kingdom has been brought to an end, exactly as what he said. TEKEL means weight, right? So he has been weighed on the scale of of sin, injustice, dishonoring God. He was found guilty in that. And then we look at UPHARSIN or Perez. It just means that it is divided in half. It just means when we look at the inscription MENE, basically in English, if you have to read it the way we have translated it, it means MENE, shekel, half shekel. Okay. TEKEL could sound like shekel in some way. UPHARSIN is divided, or Perez is divided, which means half a shekel. And then in English, it basically could just mean numbered, weighed, and divided. And so Daniel had to just interpret this to the king so that he can understand that the kingdom of Babylon's days were numbered, and it has come to an end. And just as God has prophesied and given them the prophecy in chapter 2 that Babylon will now be divided into 2 kingdoms, which is the silver part on the statue. Next, we will tackle chapter 6. So join me in the next episode. God bless you.